It's now my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Michael Margolis. Um,
Thank you so much.
Wait, Michael, so I'm going to
Oh,
give just a couple of words
perfect.
further about your background. Oh gosh, excuse me. Okay. Um, Michael joined Google Ventures in 2010 as the venture industry's first UX research partner. He's conducted over 300 research sprints for Google Venture portfolio companies in security, healthcare, biotech, medical devices, developer tools, apparel, food, women's health, transportation, insurance, and e-commerce. And I'm sure there are many more, but that's a remarkable list of domains, industries. As a UX researcher with over 30 years of experience, Michael has boosted conversion, tested new concepts, streamlined workflows, and introduced user research to hundreds of companies. I can only imagine all the good that you have done through all this work, Michael. It's a tremendous honor for the Guild to host you today. Thank you so much for being willing to share your experience with us today.
Thank you a ton, Raymond. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the thanks to the UXr Guild for hosting me. Thanks for all of you for tuning in and listening. Excited to get to talk to so many UX researchers and research fans. We can nerd out a bit about this stuff. Um, uh, to start, maybe to give me a sense of kind of who's out there, I would love if into the chat, if you guys would put in just kind of how much experience do you have working with early stage startups? Maybe you could just say, none, less than a year, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 4 years, more than 4 years, something like that, just to give me a sense of kind of who's out there. Super, thank you guys. Oh, it's a big variety. Oh, some people have done a lot, some none. Okay. Super helpful to see this. And then I'm curious, I assume most of you are researchers, but let me know kind of what your primary role is. Are you researcher, engineer, design, PM, founder, something else? Awesome, thank you. This is great. Lots of researchers, but lots of other folks too. Very cool. Oh, that's great. So everybody kind of brings a big variety of different levels of experience, total experience and experience with startups. So some of the things I mentioned, I'm sure different pieces will seem familiar to different people. And some parts will seem new to some people. So I hope everybody walks away with something new and interesting to think about after this. I'm going to leave time at the end for questions. And what I'd also love to do is have some time at the end to kind of discuss and hear your thoughts about how some of this, my approach and my way of doing this also applies to larger, more mature organizations. So I'm going to talk about it very specifically to my context, but I think a lot of this is more broadly applicable, but I'd love to hear what you think. So think about that as we go through this. As Raymond said, I'm the UX research partner at Google Ventures, and that is a very unusual job for a researcher. So as far as I know, I know of one other person who has this particular role, and so it's kind of odd. So I'll get into that and explain kind of what that is. But this job fundamentally has changed the way that I see my role as a researcher and the way that I do my work. And so I want to talk about that. I used to think about my job as being responsible for delivering insights to a team. I'd conduct research, figure out, what are their big questions, conduct that research, write reports. I was kind of a reporter, right? Representing the users to the team, persuading teams, getting them to act and do these things. And I want to explain a little bit kind of how I got here and very briefly, but just a little bit of the path that I had so that I could explain kind of some of the pieces that I picked up along the way, the different skills and habits that I've learned that I've assembled into the way that I work today. I think it's kind of relevant so you'll see as I describe some of these things where these things pop up later. So I studied anthropology. My first kind of professional jobs were in educational software. So it's long ago enough that it was discs in boxes. Okay, so I was an editor, I was a producer at the learning company at Electronic Arts, and those companies are what those exposed me to was just kind of the waterfall model of how to develop software. right? And it was my first exposure to UX and usability testing. Like, oh, there's a method to doing this kind of work and to figuring out what people think, right? What they think about your product and getting input. And I went from there to a boutique product design innovation consulting firm that was in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that was really all about innovation and strategy. And so I got to learn from kind of remarkable people how to do deep ethnographic style research and client management. And we would do these long, expensive consulting projects for clients like Alcoa, DuPont, Maytag, Ericsson, right? There's like really big blue sky things. How do you come up with new materials for DuPont? These kinds of things. Super fun, very big, long, expensive projects. And then I went from there. There was a dot-com bust, so I went to Walmart.com. And that organization is very focused on execution. It was a very big contrast and a big switch. It was all about everyday low cost. It was about speed. It was about scale. So it was, for me, learning how to take some of these other techniques I learned, these discovery research techniques, and compress them. How do I make this work much faster? And I'm on my own. And I just had to do a lot of this much quicker and compress it. It was also got me thinking about the world in terms of shopping. So I look at a lot of things as decisions and how people think about making decisions by shopping and comparing and figuring out what criteria are important to them. And it was a time when I started really combining usability with discovery. I was kind of putting these things together. And again, just getting a lot of reps, working with a huge variety of different businesses Walmart was trying to get online. So I went from there to Google. So in 2006, I started at Gmail, embedded in the Gmail team. And that was a newish thing at Google at the time, to be that researchers were embedded with a team. And that was about doing innovation, but at scale and at speed. And we did a lot of watch parties there. So Google early on had invested pretty heavily in video conferencing, and we had our one-way mirrors in some of the labs, and they did things so we could stream. So it was a lot about getting teams involved in doing that. So through all this stuff, I got pretty good at researching, delivering insights to teams, writing reports and presentations, persuading teams, doing researchery stuff. And so I was pretty good at that. I had a very practical, pragmatic approach to it, could do pretty fast. But then in 2010, I joined Google Ventures. And so that was a pretty big shift. And as you'll see, I still use and recombine a lot of these different methods and these approaches, some of the things that I've described, into my current role. But I've kind of reassembled them in different ways, I think, and it's the way that I approach this is pretty different. So I want to step back and also explain a little bit, in case anybody's not familiar with venture capital firms, which I definitely was not, just kind of what that means a little bit. So GV is Alphabet's venture capital team. So that means that we take a big bunch of money every year from Alphabet, so about $1 billion per year on average, and invest that in brand new companies. So these are mostly pretty early stage companies, not 100%, but mostly. And so when early stage, I mean, and I'll use that phrase a bunch of times, early stage means for us usually seed stage or Series A. So that means they haven't quite figured out product market fit usually. They haven't kind of started scaling dramatically. So they still tend to be relatively small, especially the ones that I'm working with. They're pretty early stage. So there are about 400 active companies. They're in just about every domain you can possibly imagine. So Raymond gave a big long list of things. It really is huge. You can look, if you go to gv.com, you can see online what that portfolio looks like. It's huge. It's everything from biotech and new therapies to healthcare companies to, I've worked on food. I've worked on, products for farmers. It's really all over the place. And a lot of those companies are too new or probably too specialized for you to have heard of them. Some of the ones that are bigger, that have been very successful, that are the familiar kind of companies would be Slack, Uber, One Medical, Toast, StockX, Nest. So those are things you probably have heard of. So over the last 14 years, I quite frankly just had the privilege of working with hundreds of amazing startup founders and teams, and gotten to do hundreds of sprints with them. And the question then is kind of like, well, so what's different about this, right? I keep saying this has changed the way I think about the way I do research. And so there's some key things about the context where I'm working that have forced me to kind of rethink this or try some new things. So one is we're investors. So the perspective on a company that I've had to adopt is a little bit different. So I used to think really much more about a project. How do I help them, a team solve this problem with a project that they have, the thing that we're trying to launch or a decision we're trying to make. And now it's a little bit of a different emphasis on the success of the company, right? So I want this company to be successful over time. It's not just this little thing, but how do we help this team grow and do what they need to do over time? I'm also always working on new businesses and domains. So I describe this variety, like it's literally like I'm meeting with those different companies, that variety companies, kind of daily, and I'm jumping in. I'm still doing a lot of hands-on research. So I'm constantly diving into new businesses and domains. So what that means is I am always the noob. So I never know kind of what we're talking about. I've done a lot of this, and we've built up a lot of patterns and pattern recognition, but I'm not the expert, and I don't usually have time to become an expert, right? Because the teams are moving pretty quickly. So rather than being the guy who's like going to go off and come back with the insights, I'm really much more relying on and leveraging the teams, which are the experts. So the people who are the founding teams of these, they are very deep in these domains. So I need to rely on them to figure out what are the insights, like what do they already know? Sometimes I think about myself, I'm like the dog running on the beach and like scaring up all the birds. And to me, I'm like, woohoo, look, it's all these exciting birds. These are so cool. And the team is like, yeah, like those, it's a lot of birds, like, but it's actually this bird and that bird and the other one. Those are really interesting. We hadn't seen those before. And it's harder for me to judge that because I don't have that depth of knowledge. The flip side of their being experts is there's this cognitive bias, and I'm sure you guys have seen this. I'm not the one to discover this, but there's a curse of knowledge. So I'm working with people who are very deep experts. And so what happens is they presume that everybody knows what they know, right? I'm sure you guys have seen this in lots of projects. And they can't really imagine not knowing what they already know. So that tends to create, or it can sometimes create blind spots. And so there's certain pattern to that, things that crop up over and over. So they generally tend to overestimate their customers' readiness to buy something, kind of where they are on their journey or how interested they are. They overestimate maybe their willingness to pay or to pay some price that they have, their willingness to change their behavior and switch and do something new. And so this is a bias that you guys see all the time, I'm sure, but it comes up a lot for me because I'm working with these it's really the core team who's really deep expertise. And as these companies are growing, they're moving super fast. There's constant change. Priorities are shifting. The teams are growing. It becomes kind of hard to keep teams aligned. It's just one of the other challenges in some of these companies, because maybe the founder is off meeting with customers and they're talking to them all the time, but it doesn't necessarily percolate back to everybody else. They don't really know, even though the team's not that big. Sometimes, especially now, people are in different places. They're distributed so much. And these founders are super impatient. And everybody, I'm sure anytime you've worked with a business owner, they're impatient, but this is the preoccupation with velocity that I experienced at GV is very different from what at least I had seen before. And so and some of it is somewhat existential, right? They have a certain amount of runway. They've basically gotten funding which represents a certain amount of time that they have to kind of race and figure out what is our unique value prop? What are we doing? What are we building? And so that they just are under a ton of pressure to figure out like what exactly should we be building here? Who exactly are our ideal customers? And we got to nail that down really fast and build and show some success and progress. And so we can get more funding usually, or figure out how to kind of move forward and down this journey towards product market fit. And I don't mean to suggest that founders aren't already talking to their customers. They're doing this a ton, right? So they are out there all the time, and it's this mantra: talk to your customers, talk to your customers. So they're doing it. They're spending a ton of time talking to customers, trying to understand them deeply. And I love that. They're sinking huge amounts of time into it. But what I see is that it's basically pretty inefficient and scattershot. So they're spending a lot of time talking to people, but they're not like you guys, they're not usually expert researchers. They don't have a researcher on staff, because it's way before that. They wouldn't have, it doesn't make sense for them to hire in the team to have a researcher. And they're spending a lot of time often meeting with people who don't really represent their ideal customer. Maybe they're spending time talking to friends and family or other people who just aren't really in that core. And it can just be, quite frankly, just really inefficient. It's a waste of time, but they're doing a huge amount of it, right? So they'll tell us, oh yeah, we've interviewed 200 people. Last month I talked to 80 people, right? So they're diving into this stuff. And so they're spending a lot of time, but there's a lot of pressure to do it. So being able to answer those questions about who is your ideal customer and what's our unique value prop and what should we be building, to be able to do that faster and to do it with more confidence, especially when you're building something brand new, you're shifting into a new market. Maybe you were built, you're successful in the UK and you want to get into the American market, or you're trying to troubleshoot why customers aren't buying. Like you've built this thing, you've launched it, it's out there, but like what's going on? It's not working quite the way we want to. So these are times that, right, you really need to dive in and figure it out and answer those questions as quickly as you can. So for me, what I've seen at GV is that this role that I played before of being kind of the insights guy, it's just not that high impact. It's not as useful. The way I think about myself now is more like a tour guide. So I have a structure and a repeatable process for them to learn faster, to answer these questions, to help the team see how to see through their customers' eyes with more objectivity, more curiosity, openness, without pitching and selling to them. And I want them to also just be building that muscle internally as a company, either to just be amazed, like, oh, this is powerful, we want to do research and we need to do more of it and we need to hire somebody, or we need to do more of it ourselves, et cetera. But I'm more of that tour guide. I'm like, come with me, let's go meet your customers. Here's a way to do this, and a way that's more efficient, that's faster. You're already doing the customer discovery. Let's accelerate that. Let's rev that up. So through years of experimentation, we've basically developed a method that accelerates that process, that customer and product discovery for these early stage startups. We found it's just super impactful, and so have pulled it together in kind of a cookbook, basically. So what I want to show you and describe to you is that process. And this is aimed really at founders. Again, I think it's applicable beyond that, but that's what I want to go through here. So I'm going to share my screens. So hopefully you can see some screens. Yes, good. I'm seeing nods. Awesome. So what we call this a Bullseye Customer Sprint. This is kind of the cookbook that we've figured out that is this repeatable way to help our founders learn what they need to and move forward and make progress. It boosts velocity in kind of a remarkable way for us. So the key to the formula, the formula behind this is 5 and 3 and 1. Okay, so what that means is 5 Bullseye customers and 3 prototypes in one day. So we carefully select 5 ideal customers and we create 3 very simple prototypes. And then we do these interviews where we have people look at these prototypes and compare and contrast them while the entire team is watching it and debriefing together and working together. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of walk through a little bit of like, why does that work? Like, what's kind of the magic behind this? The biggest key to the velocity for this, for startups that we've seen over and over, is about helping them be very specific and very focused. So every ambitious founder wants to build a product for everybody, right? But what we see over and over is that's not really a good way to. First of all, it's just really rare and it's really hard to build a product like that from the start. So usually you're starting much smaller. So if you think about something like Facebook, right? So they started out as profiles for college students, right? Or Nike was originally selling it was one particular Japanese sneaker they were selling at track meets, right? And Amazon was selling books. Like you start somewhere small. So the idea of a Bullseye customer is it's the very specific subset of your target market who initially is most likely to adopt your new product or service, right? So it's where are you going to start? And being able to focus that, it helps clarify your priorities. It helps streamline customer research. It helps you know which feedback to listen to and which stuff you can kind of ignore. The things that are, somebody's telling you, you're like, well, you're not really the person we're really focused on right now. Like, happy to hear it, but thanks. We're going to set that aside. And we're going to set it aside for now. We'll get to it, right? Again, I'm a GV. I'm an investor in your company. I want your company to be huge and wildly successful eventually, but let's start here. So this concept of the bullseye customer is really key. And it tends to be much more specific than we see personas or people's descriptions of ideal customer profiles. Kind of what's the distinguishing characteristic that separates and identifies these people for you that we can go after. So this is key. The other thing is about open-ended interviews. A lot of you are researchers, are research friendly. You kind of get this, you understand this. My hammer for this, right, is the quickest way that I know how to help a team see the world, see their product through their customers' eyes is to do these kinds of open-ended interviews, right? So it's about hearing stories, behaviors, expectations, concerns, the why, right? You guys have seen this and done this, I'm sure. So the open-ended interviews are just huge bang for the buck. But part of the key that I've learned is doing these in small batches. So what I mean by that is I clump them. So I don't want to conduct like one interview on Monday, one on Wednesday, another 2 on Friday, and then another one the next week. Like, partly because my memory is so bad, that makes it super hard to go do the analysis and figure out like, what did we learn? If we can clump them in one day, the patterns become very clear. You can just kind of get through it and see, oh, this is answering our big questions because we're clear and specific about what we wanted to learn, and you do them in a big clump, and then you can like run almost like an experiment and then move forward. So open-ended interviews, but in small batches. And then we compare prototypes. So teams tend to invest, or there's a risk that teams will invest a lot of time and effort into one particular thing that they're working on. And we don't want them to get too wed to that. And so having some variety partly pushes them to explore a bigger variety of different ideas. But also when I'm working with customers and doing interviews, it helps me get a bigger breadth of feedback, of depth, of richness of that conversation. Because I can show them some range of possibilities that they won't be able to imagine on their own, right? That's not their job, is to like imagine what the possible future is for whatever this product is you're doing. And you can see it kind of harkens back to my days at Walmart, right? I think about everything in terms of shopping. So imagine that you were shopping for a couch or anything else that you recently shopped for, right? If you look at one couch, like if I were to show you a couch and wanted feedback, you're like, oh, that's nice, whatever. Like I can get some feedback to that. Like, yeah, I don't like the color. It's not that comfortable. The size is perfect, whatever. Okay. But if I can show you 3 couches, like as you're going through the shopping process, you're like, oh, that's interesting. So now I can see there's kind of this variety of different sorts of fabrics. Well, I kind of like this sort of fabric more like that. And this one, I like the way the cushions are made over here because these ones have down and these ones are foam and these ones are whatever, right? You start to be able to compare and contrast the details in a different way. And it helps me elicit what's important to you about couches and why that's important to you. So having multiple prototypes that I can compare is really powerful. And then we make it a team sport. This is really kind of, I think, has become sort of our secret weapon. The UX watch parties are the best example of this. So while I'm conducting an interview, it's live streaming, the team is all watching it, and we're facilitating them they're all taking notes, they're debriefing in between each interview. Everybody gets on the same page, everybody is fired up because they're seeing this all through, they're seeing the customers, and I haven't found anything else that kind of conveys in the same way what's going on or how these stories about customers, except for people seeing them. It might be I'm just terrible at making highlight reels and doing that kind of thing, but having people watch these is really powerful. Hopefully you guys have seen this, you've seen it yourselves. And it means I don't write a report at the end because everybody has experienced it and gone through the whole study together. They know the stories, they know these customers we spoke to. I don't spend time persuading or explaining what's happened and trying to convince teams what to do. They've seen it, they're fired up. It also means that if there's some particular stakeholder on the team who had a very particular idea that they wanted, like everybody has seen the results together. It makes it hard for somebody to kind of then ram something down the rest of the team's throats at the end is another little bonus. But these are kind of the key elements of why this Bullseye Customer Sprint works, right? So what I'd love to do is just talk through an example of, what does this look like in reality? So I worked with a company a few years ago. They were developing a new service to deliver specialty medications. Okay, so these are expensive medications that are for treating complex chronic conditions. These aren't things you can get from a regular pharmacy. Okay, and so what they had kind of these big questions, and they were trying to figure out before they built it out, right? You want to ideally do this before you build it. Are they trying to plan this delivery for something like, I need it right away. Like, this is a really important disease. I have a serious condition and I need the thing, like, get it as fast as you can get it to me. Like, whenever that is, I'll just wait and I'll be here and I'll get it whenever you can get it to me. I need it right away. Or is it more about like, well, I don't need it like right now. I need it soon, but like what's more important is maybe get it to me between 2 and 2:15 tomorrow or whatever. And that has really big implications for the logistics that they had to plan out. Like, how are they going to optimize for that? And so that was a big issue. What is the unique value prop that they're trying to solve for? Exactly what is this that they're doing? They had some technology to help them do this, but what is it? And who's the exact person that they're after? Who's this ideal customer? And those have key implications for how are they going to go ahead and size the market and size that opportunity and for the logistics. Okay, and so I know from past experience that it's not going to be everybody with specialty medications, right? You just know there's like some distinguishing characteristics. I don't know what they are yet, and they weren't sure what they were yet, but that's what we needed to figure out. So I didn't want to talk to just anybody who has specialty medications, but there's some subset, again, this very specific subset of the target market who initially is most likely to adopt. That's what I want to figure out. That's that bullseye. And then I want to set aside some of these other folks. And we'll get to them later, but not yet. So that's what we needed to figure out. So first thing I do is we run a bullseye exercise. This is another example of kind of making this a team sport. So I get the team together. This usually takes 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the team. And what I do is essentially interview them. And so I want to define for them, like, what are the inclusion criteria? Who do we want? What are the exclusion criteria? And exclusion criteria is really interesting. Inclusion is usually people are pretty good at that. Like, yeah, these are, the big market we want. These are all the people we're after. But those exclusions usually are a good place to dwell because teams, as I said before, they're reluctant to set people aside. And so it's worth spending some time brainstorming there and really thinking like, no, some of these people are not going to be the right people. And let's be clear about that and get that down. And a lot of this is, it's like in their heads, and the exercise is about getting them to write it down and also to getting them to agree. So doing it as a group is a really interesting way to get alignment because teams will develop some shorthand about how they talk about their customers. They're like, oh, it's like the chronically ill. We're delivering medications for the chronically ill. And then you get in a room and people are like, oh, wait, that's what you meant by chronically ill? I didn't realize that. I kind of had this other picture in my head of who these people are. So it's really a good way to again, just be very specific and detailed. And then we think about triggers. So triggers are particular experience or event or something that's happened or maybe has not yet happened to somebody that makes them particularly ready. They're like ripe for this experience because something's happened. The image I always have of this is like if I were in some room and like it was filled with people who get specialty medications, like what are the questions I'm going to yell from a chair in the middle of the room to like sort people out and find the people that I want. So we go through this and I run through this interview with them. And these are kind of the core things. Again, these aren't demographics that I'm particularly interested. Sometimes there's some aspect of that, but it's more about behaviors, experiences. What else have they used? Is there some other kind of product that's related to this that they should have used or not have used that would make them a good candidate or not? Sometimes it's something like who are they living with or where are they living? Are they in the suburbs or are they in some urban setting? What else is going on here? And whether or not they're satisfied with the solution that they have right now can be a really good indicator. Because somebody who is very satisfied with the way things are working now probably is not so motivated to switch, right? And I also want to avoid anybody who has experience or knows too much, kind of not your typical representative kind of person. Again, I'm going to ultimately recruit 5 people, so I'm going to have 5 slots. So I don't want somebody in there who is like, oh yeah, I'm actually a pharmacist. Like, oh, okay, well that's like your input's probably interesting, but not perfectly representative for what I need. So we're going to go through this and just pushing through this interview for a lot of specificity. I'm just drilling down, and you guys, a lot of research here, you've done this, you've recruited, but there's like I'm pushing really far, further than usually doing it and trying to get them to prioritize. So it's hard to get them to sit, they're like, well, it's this and that. Like, well, if you had to pick one, who would you pick? So at learnmorefaster.com, there's a lot of the resources are there, all the resources you need to run this. So you can see there's a document there. It's kind of my template I use, which is essentially my interview guide that I run people through. And you take a look at that, you'll notice I use it for many different businesses. So there will be some questions you're like, this isn't relevant to what I'm doing. That's fine, just ignore that. Just pay attention to the other ones. So you can grab that. So for this company, this is kind of what they came up with. So this is their kind of informed hypothesis, right? They know a lot about the space, but they don't know everything yet. And so what we're after are people who have their very particular chronic conditions that they were after. And then we want to make sure that these folks have used certain delivery services already. If somebody, for example, has never had like food delivered or some other food, not even had prescriptions delivered at all, they're probably not the core of that bullseye, right? They probably, like, that's another hump somebody would need to get over, right? Like, well, yeah, you could have things delivered and you could also have these delivered. We want somebody who's kind of already past that. Make sure that they have insurance that's paying for their medications, and somebody who's still busy during the day, and they're not just available to wait all the time, all day for whenever these things are delivered. And we're going to exclude people who have somebody else taking care of this for them. Like maybe their spouse or somebody else manages their prescriptions, or has knows too much or has personal experience working in this industry. And we want people who have, like, something's gone wrong or they're just dissatisfied with kind of the status quo here. Okay. And then when we're recruiting, you just have to be super picky. And so then we want to think about, what are the value props? What do I want to show? What are these prototypes? If I can find existing things, if there are competitors out there, I want to use those. Those are free prototypes. Those are awesome. I love that. I don't want to have to build anything. But here, what I'm thinking about is, like, what are the key variables, the features and the options that we can kind of tease out and use to recombine into different recipes. Right? So these are like ingredients that I'm going to use to put into these prototypes that then I can have people kind of compare and contrast. So I'm going to tease out some of these different possibilities. And then we're going to put them into very simple prototypes and value props. So that's too small for you to read probably, but the point is that they just look like home pages, right? So this is very familiar for people. They're used to looking, we're all used to looking at these kinds of things. So they're realistic looking, but they don't do anything. These are flat PDFs. Maybe we make them in Canva or in Google Slides or whatever people are comfortable with. It's mostly, a lot of it is really a writing exercise, because we're not, it forces, just going through this exercise has been really valuable. So it forces people to articulate, like, what is the value prop? Like, what can we agree? Like, actually, I thought it was this, or you thought it was the other thing. Like, what are we actually building? So it's this very familiar format that represents different recipes of these specific detailed features and possibilities. One of the things that we found is a little bit magical is before I do the interviews, we ask the team, what do they predict? So we're recruiting the customers and we're doing all of that, but I want to know, what's a snapshot of what did you think you were going to learn before the interviews? And it's a really helpful way it's like a check before I do the interviews. This conversation usually helps direct me and helps me figure out how to to target and be how to tailor the interview guide to make sure I'm getting what they want. It's just another way to have that conversation about their goals and objectives. But it's also a way to make sure that I have a snapshot of what do they know or what do they think they're going to learn. Because after we go through the interviews, there's this hindsight bias, right? I'm sure you guys have all seen this. After the fact, people forget that what they didn't know and what they thought was going to be things that they think were predictable, right? They're like, oh, well, we knew that. That seems obvious. I'm like, well, it seems obvious now because we just interviewed 5 people, but yesterday you had no idea, right? You thought this other completely thing. So this has been really handy for us. And so then I conduct these as 2-part interviews. So the first part of this interview is kind of this open-ended discovery conversation about your prescriptions and your past experiences with prescriptions. What's worked, what hasn't worked, how have you done it in the past, how do you feel about that, these kinds of things, right? I'm just digging into that. The second half is where we're really delving into these pros and cons. So again, I'm presenting these multiple prototypes and having them not just tell me like, yeah, this is the winner, I like this one better, but to pick apart the details and compare and contrast so that I can tease out what matters to you. What are kind of the important bits and pieces of this so that I could take all of those other pieces and go create my ideal version later, right? I don't want the winner. So we start with these. And then in my head, what I'm going towards is what I want at the end is this, right? I'm trying to figure out like, oh, these were your favorite parts per individual that I interview, but then as a pattern, at the end of the day, it just becomes really clear which are the bits and pieces. I want to collect all like the best little Lego pieces that I can go construct the most awesome, perfect version of this. Okay. And so with this company, there was one other thing that was a little unusual. And so there was just kind of one more thing that they had to figure out. And that is that the way that they wanted to deliver it was through drones. So this was kind of an odd addition. And I didn't want the reaction to drones to like overwhelm the basic value, the response to the basic value proposition. Because if I had started when I'm interviewing people and be like, oh, so there's these drones, and be like, wait, what? Like it would just totally I worried it would just totally sideline everything. Like, holy cow, you have drones flying to my house? Like, what are you talking about? So I would go through that whole interview and gather like, okay, noted, we understand which parts of this are important or not important to you. And then what I did was then present, like there are different possibilities of ways we might deliver this, right? So maybe it's coming from a little robot that's rolling out, or somebody, it's just a courier, or it's actually a pharmacist who's going to come, or maybe this drone thing is going to drop it in your backyard. And so then we could have that conversation about the pros and cons of that, what their concerns were about that, what they liked or didn't like about having drones, which is pretty interesting. So this is kind of what the schedule looks like. I run through, basically do an interview, debrief with the team, do an interview, and we're just like cycling through that all day. So again, it's 5 interviews in one day. We're banging that out with the whole team taking notes and watching. And then at the end of the day, we capture the big conclusions and the patterns. So each person individually fills out a form that's basically just grabbing what's your 3 big takeaways? What did you learn, right? You've just sat through all of this and gone through this whole thing all day. And so they capture that goes into a big spreadsheet, right? It's just a Google form. And then we can kind of discuss and review that and figure out what do we understand as a group? What do we want to do next? How are we thinking about this? And then I don't have to write a report. So the team has these big takeaways. After just one day, we're trying to figure out, okay, was it predictable windows or do they want it ASAP? And so it became pretty clear that actually the narrow definable windows were much more important. People weren't waiting to the very last minute to get this medication. They needed it, was important, but they weren't like, oh my gosh, I used my last pill. I need the thing to get here right away. And we went through this. We actually did 2 rounds of this. So after the first round, we could see there was like some heat. There were certain people like, oh, there's something over here. People who have special needs where there's, for some reason, they really need, they can't leave that medication out like on the stoop, right? Either it's got, one of the big things was it needs to be refrigerated. So if it's cold chain, I need to not have it sitting out on my stoop. I need to get it so that it's not just sitting out in the sun. Or I have for some reason, real big fear of theft, or I need to be able to sign for this. So there were key things. So after the first round that we then were like, that's interesting. We're going to home in on that, recruit more people like that. We're going to like shift and refine our bullseye, repeat this, and confirm that this is kind of the key people and the key value prop of what we're delivering was for these people. So it was just 2 rounds of this, nailed it down. And you can see here, this is the company's website. I just grabbed this the other day. So this is still on there. It just highlights the key things. So it's about, emphasizes cold chain. It emphasizes scheduling. It's all too small for you to see, I'm sure. Scheduling for your own peace of mind, so you can schedule when you want it. And it's just, this is what they're building, right? They've done it. It's been implemented. Lots of headlines about them delivering via drone, delivering prescriptions to all these folks, which is kind of remarkable for so many different reasons. And so we've run this playbook many, many times with a huge range of different companies. So these are, as I've talked through, right, these are the key ingredients why this works and why we've just found it super powerful. And we're pretty excited to be able to share it. So it's something that we've used for a long time, have just found it just really effective. Like it feels a little bit, quite frankly, like a party trick. We just do it every time. It's mind-blowing for the teams. And so we're really excited to make this available. As Raymond said, it's totally free. So excited that we're able to do that. You can just go to learnmorefaster.com and get it. All the materials that you need are there. Everything, all the templates, everything that you would need. There's even a really nerdy research playlist that you can grab. I use that while we're waiting for participants to show up. So it's all there. One request is to make it a little bit easier for people to find. I added a version on Amazon. There's like a Kindle version. This is all free at learnmorefaster.com. But if you are so inclined, if you can leave a rating or a review over at Amazon, that's a big help. So appreciate that. And so with that, eager to chat with you, stick around as long as you want, answer any questions you have, and to hear how you think parts of this may or may not apply to bigger companies and other kinds of contexts. And thanks a ton.
Michael, that's so awesome. Thank you for sharing this refined sprint formula. A lot of interesting questions coming in, and so let's take some of those. A lot of them are on the recruiting, finding the participants, because obviously that's a really important part of this. And so do you have, so one question is how much time is spent on recruiting those participants? What kind of recruiting ops support do you have? Is there a certain resource you go to typically find these people, or are they already known early customers?
So in terms of ops, I don't really have ops, so it's me. So my team, my gigantic GV research team is just me. So I have 2 amazing design partners I get to work with. So Kate Aronowitz and Vanessa Cho. And so they help me often. They're facilitating and working kind of the back room with teams and helping me with this, but it's just us. So what I rely on pretty heavily is for most recruiting. It depends. Again, if I need to find astronauts or something, like it's a little different. But for most recruiting, I rely on user interviews to recruit, or respondent, mostly user interviews. And what I found is it's remarkably effective for me. So I can recruit in a matter of, depending on what I need, just a few days often. If it's something that's very, very specialized, like I need to talk to particular oncologists or something like that, I have to go a different route, usually, because they're not hanging out on user interviews and they're not like waiting to just show up on my schedule. But for most things, that's what I do. And what I do is I go through this exercise, as I described, this bullseye exercise, to define the criteria very, very specifically and in a measurable way, right? So that I can figure out pretty quickly, write a screener questionnaire that allows me to figure out quickly, are these people in or out? Like it's some very measurable example. So for example, what I mean by measurable is not just, teams will say like, well, they're active on iPad. Like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, well, they use it for this amount of time or this many days a week, like something that I can really kind of dig into. And then I write a very careful screener questionnaire. And a couple things that are really important about that. Part of it is, and you can see I have provided, if you go to the resources on learnmorefaster.com, there's a bunch of examples. So I provided a lot of screeners there to show you what I mean, how I do this. One of the tricks is to write it so that you're not telegraphing what the correct answer is, right? If I were to post something on user interviews that says, I need 120, I'm offering $125 to talk to, I don't know, 18-year-old boys who are active on their iPads. I get a whole bunch of people like, I'm active on my, yes, sir, I'm happy to do that. So what I need to do is describe, is to provide a bunch of options to see, like, are they answering the questions that I have in the way that, what am I saying? I might have a list of multiple kinds of products that they might use, and then see, like, did they choose iPad out of a variety? Or I would, what I'm doing more often these days is ask certain questions open-ended in a way to see, like, if I ask what are the products that they use most often in the course of a day, to get their work done, and they don't mention an iPad in an open-ended thing, then, like, that's not the person I want to talk to. Anyway, so I can go on for a long time about recruiting, but maybe I'll pause there.
Another question is, what if the team really struggles to articulate their ideal customer?
It's a sign of a couple things if they do. So one is, what I encourage them to do is, like, let's pick a place to start, right? So we're going to do a Bullseye Customer Sprint, but I often emphasize to them, like, this isn't the only chance to do this. We're just going to try it, and we're going to start someplace, and then we'll go from there. And so it helps do a couple things. It helps reduce the pressure, and it helps them then at least think about it in terms of sequence. Like, well, who do you want to start with? So start with is often something that's like, well, maybe the top priority is who you're starting with, but mostly just to reduce the pressure. Let's try to be as careful and make the best guess that we can. And if you have more than one, that's okay. Like, let's define those as distinct groups and then go interview them as distinct groups. I want to talk to 5 over here and then 5 over there, but do them separately so that I can see the patterns. If I mush them all together, then it's just the few times that this doesn't work or hasn't worked for me is when the recruiting is, for one reason or another, has not gone correctly, or the team did it in a messy way and they weren't picky enough. And you end up with, like, a mush of people that are not specific and distinct. And then you're like, well, I don't know what the pattern was. Like, was that person representative of that particular type of customer? Was it just an idiosyncrasy of that person? Like, I don't know what to draw from that. So yeah, so hope that helps.
Imagine that some teams are further along in their understanding of who that ideal is, and some you're just really getting started.
Yep, but just get started and try. And then you pretty quickly, the thing that's amazing to me about this is how fast you learn. That's kind of the goal. So you do it, and then what happens is the team's like, oh, okay, well, now we realize that it's for these combinations of reasons, those people are not great people for us to spend our time on. Like, okay, well, if you learn that, I mean, one of the most powerful things here is to figure out who not to pay attention to or what not to build, right? So it has happened when I've done this where we've gone through a few rounds, and the founder in the end decided to kill the project. And he told me, he's like, you saved me a huge amount of pain. Like, we went through this and then we were convinced, like, there's not really something here for us. Like, we're going to focus on this other part of our business. This is not something for us to do. That is a huge win, right?
That's a great way to look at it. I love that in the forward of your book where you said, we're just trying to save teams time, money, energy. The quicker they can get to some of these learnings, the quicker they can either kill bad ideas or develop good ones.
Yeah, because we've all probably been in teams where there are those debates that kind of drag on, like nobody's willing to cut bait, or it just kind of keeps going. You're not sure. Well, I talked to somebody else. They seem to like it. It helps to just know and have more confidence. The other thing a founder has told me is that by going through this, they learned what no looked like. So they talk to a lot of people and they're talking to their customers all the time and they're getting feedback. And a lot of the feedback that they get can be sort of mildly positive feedback, and like, oh, this seems like this would be interesting, this kind of product. And when I hear that, I know that that's a no. That means this person's never going to do that. Like you're not sensing the excitement or the enthusiasm that I've seen from some products. And so he said it helped calibrate him also. He's like, oh, now I know what no looks like. So when I do this, that helps me too.
That's very interesting. Okay, I'm going to say to the audience, if you want to raise your hand, we'll call on a few people. I'm going to give you this one more question, though, that was inspired by your last comment. Someone asks, do teams ever request surveys? Or do you decide in some circumstances to use a survey?
Yeah, teams do. So my bias depends on what the question. I mean, fundamentally, it depends on the question that they're trying to answer, what the right method is. So that's the short answer. Most typically, what I see is a couple things whenever I'm talking to teams about surveys. One is doing this kind of work, doing some qualitative work is very high ROI before you're going to invest time or effort or reputation or energy into anything, whether it's building a new product or launching some big market research thing, project, or doing a design sprint. Like, it's always going to save you time and help you figure out what questions to ask in that survey or who to survey. So it helps streamline that. So even when they do come to me and they are requesting a method, usually I dig into like, what are you really trying to figure out? Like, what are your questions? Like, starting with a method for me is not the best starting point. The other thing that comes up with surveys, as maybe some of you have seen, I see a lot of surveys or data that has been generated by surveys I just don't have a lot of faith in, because it's really hard to write a good survey, right? It takes people like you guys to write a really good survey. And it's really easy to generate charts and like data that look like somebody should believe it. But I look at them like, yeah, can you show me the survey and how did you do this? Because I'm like, it's usually not great. So I'm usually trying to steer them towards, let's do some qualitative research the way that I would do it and let you see what this looks like. And they usually say, no, we talk to customers all the time. And I'm like, okay, well, let's try it this my way. And afterwards they're like, oh, yeah, that looks really different from what I was doing. That's not the way we were doing it, which is what I want, right? I want them to learn, but ultimately I want them to build this muscle.
Awesome. Okay, Rama has been.
Sorry. And the other thing about a survey is we will use it after we get to a certain point. There are times when, if they need more confidence, we've figured out a bunch of stuff like, okay, now go quantify that and validate over a larger sample. Okay. So it's not that I don't believe in surveys at all. Obviously, it has its place, but it's a little bit about sequencing for me and who does it.
Okay, makes sense.
Thank you, Raymond.
Okay, thank you, Rama.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi.
Okay. This is a question I have. Based on your experience, what do you think is the loss of information or insight you have doing these kind of sprint methods? Because sometimes what seems like the obvious top of the mind reactions or insights don't always tell the true story. And it is only when you have spent time with the data and gone over it again that you're able to draw the real patterns of the real insights. So what has your experience been with that?
So my experience is that working with these startups who are moving super fast is that, so it's a couple things. So one is I want them to triangulate. So this isn't necessarily all that they're going to do. Sometimes it is, because they're just like, they're moving. They've already we've had the meeting and they're already building it or whatever. So sometimes they're not going to pause. And what happens is, in my experience in the startups, basically they're moving forward and doing different things and building confidence. And this is one of those things that helps them steer. I want them to triangulate it against other data that they may have, either the data that's out there, because if it's completely contrary to everything anyone has seen anywhere else, you're like, okay, that's weird. Like, let's try this again or try something different. But often what happens is, especially if it's something, a company that already has launched, and so they have some data, it helps it inspires new questions to go ask of the data that they have. They're like, huh, that's interesting. I didn't know if people are doing that, like it suggests some other pattern or something, or some other reason people are doing it. Like, yeah, we never looked at the correlation between those things. Like that's odd. And so they can kind of dig into that data and go see and either say like, oh yeah, that's not true. Like that's Margolis is crazy. Like that's just, we're not seeing that. Or like, oh, that's really, we just hadn't thought of that. And now we see it there. So this is, for me, it's I'm doing this in a context where I guess maybe arrogantly, I would say we've done this enough that I feel like I have some confidence of where to cut the corners, if that makes sense. So there are corners being cut. Like there's no question. This is not the same as doing some large rigorous study, because they're not going to do that. They don't have time to do that. Often maybe can't afford it. It's possible that down the road they'll do it, but it's just about, again, how can I help you learn more faster as you're racing, along? And this depends on some domains, because you can imagine in like biotech, in terms of rigor, like there's a whole lot of other like actual, like I call it like real researchers, like doing science somewhere to develop a new therapy. But this can help you like think about like, well, if we're running a clinical trial, like who do we want to target and how do we message the clinical trial and how do we attract people to that? Like there's a bunch of other work that's going to happen, but it can save you just an enormous amount of time. I don't know if that addresses your question, right? But so much of it for me is the context that I'm doing this in.
Wow, Michael, so much great information. I have a question. We have a question queued up. We are at time, so I want to respect that. If anyone wants to sign off, of course they're welcome to, but if you're willing to stay on, maybe we can just ask another question or two.
Happy to.
I want to sneak mine in, and then Isabel is queued up. My question is, you mentioned ROI, and we actually had a leader of a startup group kind of question, well, can you demonstrate the ROI of this early research? And it seems so obvious to researchers that it's more important at the start than ever, that it's incredibly valuable. But do you have maybe a few examples you could share of how teams redirected based just on the 5-3-1 one-day sprint? And
yeah, I mean, in terms of ROI, it's I don't have like specific metrics that I use or dollars saved.
right.
And one thing I want to mention, like obviously this is not the magic key to successful exit for a startup, right? About 100,000 things have to go right for a startup to work, right? I'm just like getting to participate a little bit in their journey and helping. So I just like to say that, like I'm not taking responsibility or taking credit for what these folks are building. But the kinds of impact are, like I described the example where the founder killed the project, right? That saved them. And they have this other business, and I'm working with him on something else. They have this other piece of their business that's taking off. And so it's allowed them to focus and put their energy into that. So one benefit there is it just saved them a huge amount of time and effort and money building something that was just going to be, it wasn't going to work probably as well as the other stuff. So it's about avoiding distraction. So the ways that I think about impact, I guess, maybe and then I'll give examples. So one is avoiding distraction. One is just saving time, saving money. And it's about having confidence kind of moving forward and de-risking things that you're doing. Yeah. So other examples of kind of what's happened. So I worked with a company that was developing, it's essentially they deliver primary care services, healthcare services. And so they were developing a kind of a subscription loyalty plan for people. And it was really targeted at folks who don't have health insurance for a bunch of different reasons. That was their target. And we ran through one of these, and we did it in one day. And that was the one I think we had on the team. There were 40 people watching it. It was a very large watch party. It was, I think, our record. At the end of that day, the CEO said, we shouldn't build this product for those customers. He was like, that was, and so we did it again. He's like, it became clear it didn't fit for them. They wanted a la carte services. They weren't going to pay for a subscription to loyalty plan. And so we switched it, and they went after people who basically had high deductible, they have insurance, but they're essentially paying out of pocket. So it was a very dramatic switch of like who they're targeting. And I'm not going into all the details of it, obviously, because we're doing this quick and because I can't talk about it. But that was an example. We worked with a company that was selling life insurance, and they were targeting millennials. And so that a bunch of what they were doing, the bet that they were making was that they were tuning the experience and the journey for a particular demographic group. And so when we talked to those folks, we discovered that everybody felt like, well, oh yeah, I should get life insurance. That's like on my list. Like, oh yeah, I should get life insurance. I should get it. But nobody was doing anything about it. What we saw, and it was one of these curse of knowledge examples where they were very surprised people weren't like further along on the journey. Like, how could they not have done this? Of course they need this. What we saw was that it wasn't until people had certain triggers. So if you just had a baby or you just got married, now it's gone from like, oh yeah, I should get life insurance to like, oh, actually, like I need to buy life insurance. Like I need to, like in the next 2 weeks or whatever, I need to go do this. I'm now motivated and I have this trigger. And so that really realigns the way you're framing the messaging, the marketing, the education that you're providing about how and when to do this. So those are a couple examples. Yeah, I can stop there. I don't know.
Those are awesome examples. Thank you so much. Isabel, feel free to ask your question.
Awesome. Thank you. I love what you said about bringing stakeholders and founders in as close to the process and the people as possible. I agree that I feel like has such more of an impact than them reading a report. No, sorry. Do you ever, though, struggle to get client or stakeholder participation? Sometimes I've found that asking them to clear a full day in their calendar either just isn't possible or they don't see, I guess, the benefit of clearing a whole day versus tuning in for 1 or 2 or reading a report after.
So this is a place where part of the privilege that I have is I'm in a very unique, weird role. So I literally won't do it unless they show up. And I can get away with that. So I want to acknowledge like that's not, everybody can't necessarily get away with that. So that's one thing I just want to say, like, yeah, I get that sometimes is weird. But the other piece of it is that I'm only working on things that are their top priority. And so we go through these exercises where that's why they're talking to us, is because there's something that they're worried about. Like when we meet with founders, the thing that we're asking them all the time is, what's keeping you up at night? Right? Because they'll come with something else, like I need a survey. I'm like, okay, whatever. Like, what's keeping you up at night? Like, oh, this other thing. Like, I'm really nervous. We wanted to move into a new market, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, if that's actually like a top priority, like you literally are not sleeping because of this, we have an idea of like a way to try to solve that. Like, do you want to, is that worth a day to you? Right? So it's, I'm only working on something that is so critical to them and to their business, and they need it, and to their team, that, and I'm trying, part of what we've done through this, developing this method and this cookbook, is to try to streamline it and reduce as much friction as possible. Like doing it in one day, as I described, logistically, that works really well for a whole bunch of reasons. It's easier to schedule and I can get everybody in there in a day and we can, whatever. But part of it is like, it's just a day. You told me this is the most important critical thing for your business. And like, if it's not worth the day, then maybe it's not. And it certainly happens that you can imagine my pipeline of projects that come in, I have this conversation like, oh my gosh, yes, I want to do this. And then I don't hear from them again. I'm like, okay, well, you're at a startup. Like, I get that. Like, stuff is happening all the time, like your priority. And if it's not top priority now, then let's not do it now. Which isn't necessarily helpful to you, but there are times when like there are signs to us that it's not the right time. A lot of our work is diagnosing that. Like, are you receptive to actually doing something different? Like if you're just like you're an artist, you're the founder, the artist, you just need to express this thing, you need to build it, and nothing's gonna, like, until you build it, you're not gonna take any, just go build it. Like I would rather you don't, but you're not gonna listen until you do. And so they just have to kind of get through that. Sorry, Zoom just asked me if I was speaking in Spanish. Yeah, so just getting them focused on what is the part of the burden is on me as a researcher to research the founders and the stakeholders to make sure that I understand what are their top priorities, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if that helps, but I do acknowledge I'm in a weird spot because I can just be like, okay, we're not doing it. But part of that is like, it's a way to test, like, is this really important? Are you going to staff it? Are you ready to do it? Are you going to make a decision based on this or not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right
I feel
time?
like I've found more success with that, especially when we're working directly with founders. I think it can be a little harder when the stakeholder team is a little bit broader and maybe our main client is someone else on the leadership team. But yeah, just getting
right. And that's a key thing, is figuring out like who's actually the decider here, right? Because it could be that the founder, like I want the founder there, but the founder might be like, actually, Jane is like actually head of this project, and it's up to her to, like, she's going to drive it, and whatever she does is fine. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I don't need to have the founder if I have the business owner or whoever's responsible driving it. That's okay.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So many great insights, Michael. You've been so generous to share this formula, to share your time, to go overtime answering questions. It's just been a real pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there are other questions. We have recorded the session. We will share it out. And so you're free to rewatch and hone in on the parts that are of most interest. Thank you so much. Awesome.
Thank
Thanks
you all.
everyone for coming. Sorry that we didn't have time for the breakout networking, but it's just great. We had such a vibrant Q&A session.
Thank you all very much.